Boardroom Bound, Episode 60, What Every Board Member Needs to Know, with Deborah Hicks Midanek.
Often at the board level, what you're asked to do is approve the transaction, the financing, the share issuance. The board then thinks their job is done. You know, it doesn't all happen just because you slam two companies together.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And with this episode, we're doing something special. We're doing a mini-series on the skills matrix. This is something I really want all of our audience to understand because this is how boards fill their seats. They're evaluating who do we have today, what are the skills, the expertise, the competencies, and who do we need for the future to fill those next few spots. So what I want to do is introduce you over a series of several episodes to some good friends of mine who are specific skilled people and understand how those map back to a board who'd be looking for them. And it's directly translatable for everybody who thinks about how do they build their own position of authority, become known for something in a niche, and then figuring out what boards does that fit with, and therefore go out and do the right networking to land the board seats. In today's show, we're speaking with Deborah Midanek. She is someone who is incredibly well experienced on boards. She is the chair of 6 boards of directors, and she's also been the director on multiple companies over the last few decades. And she's also an author on the subject. The book is called The Governance Revolution, What Every Board Member Needs to Know. She is deep in expertise in M&A and strategic alliances, and will be talking to us today about how to position yourself if that is your background, but also if you're someone like her who has so much general, broad knowledge of the board. So whatever you are in your board journey, whatever you're thinking about for how you brand yourself, how you position yourself, the knowledge you need for a board, we're going to cover all of that today. Let's jump into the show. Deborah Midanek, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
And thank you so much, Alexander. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm thrilled to speak with someone who has just so much general knowledge. You and I were joking around this beforehand. If you've been on, 6 boards of directors and multiple companies over so many years, you've covered so much ground, so many different committees you've been on. But of course, everyone also has some areas of specialization. And helpful for our audience, we'll also talk about you today and sort of that knowledge that you bring in the strategic alliances in the M&A space, in addition to so many other places that you've covered, and how that works as a brand, how you take that forward. But for our audience to sort of look back and go, wow, she sort of gets it all. She's written books on this subject. She's an expert. But you didn't start there, right? You had to put one foot in front of the other and get there eventually. Maybe you can begin by just walking us through how you got to be where you are today.
Well, one, I think you're very flattering in the sense that I don't think of myself as an expert. I think of myself as a perennial student who's always learning something. And, my key is, I think, to keep moving. But, I wasn't a very good employee. I was very curious. I was very eager to say, well, why don't we do it this way? Is this a better way to do it? Which sort of put me in the position of, one of my bosses said, you think like top management, but you're not top management yet. You actually have to learn something before you get there. And he did have a point about that. But my company failed that I worked for in 1990. And it was not broadly known that this notorious company, which was making headlines every day, was owned almost entirely by its employees. So I was annoyed on behalf of those employees. And it was an investment bank called Drexel Burnham Lombard Group, which many have forgotten, but it was quite well known at the time. And so I looked for legal counsel who could advise employees. And, of course, every lawyer hung up on me until I realized that, in fact, I wasn't calling on behalf of employees. I was calling on behalf of shareholders. Mm-hmm. So I managed to, through a very strange and fun grassroots effort, running with my sneakers, running up and down the elevator banks, to organize an equity committee to represent the shareholders and to get that group appointed by the court, the bankruptcy court in this case. from that position, and I was elected chairman of that, I negotiated a new board of directors for the company because it was a very vitriolic situation in which trust was nowhere to be found. And if we didn't put a new board in, it was highly likely that the court would appoint a bankruptcy trustee, which would have meant the sacrifice of a huge amount of value in that portfolio. So I ended up with sort of odd allies. I managed to recruit some new directors, and I ended up being the consensus director myself. And it was a fabulous place to learn because I was in the middle. Excuse me, Alex, as soon as I get on the recording, I find myself coughing.
Not a problem. You just take your time and collect yourself. We'll edit that out. No problem.
I did read the notes, excuse me, about having the water available.
That's okay. I've had to learn.
Anyway.
I've had to learn that myself. It's not a problem.
It's funny. Anyway, so in the middle of this crazy vitriolic case, I had tremendous education in that I was the unexpected and somewhat unwelcome dinner guest. Nobody expected me to sit at that board table and have any influence at all. So that was a perfect circumstance for me to learn and, in fact, develop a lot of influence simply by asking questions. So once I had done that, I was totally ruined as an employee of anybody. So I had to start my own company. I started my own investment management company, and I kept on with the independent director roles so that I could keep my hand in that. And I sort of did a number of distressed or quasi-distressed at that time roles. And eventually I evolved into a restructuring guru and turned pro in that. So I work with a lot of different companies, as we were discussing before the call, and help them figure out what their problems really were, and then help them solve the problems. I served as a director of a number of those companies, and then grew from there into somebody who also serves growth companies, private companies, early stage companies, and so on.
And your reputation is built from there, right? Because it's expanded out. Now you've got sort of quasi-governmental agencies that you work with as well, and really built this, I want to call it an entire interesting portfolio of different board opportunities and on different types of committees, on chairing some boards. So at this point, you've kind of been there, seen there, and done it all, and you're in a great position to help a lot of us to understand what we should do for aspiring directors or perhaps a new director, and you're going, wow, I signed up for this, didn't really know what I was getting into. I got to figure that out now. And that's something you and I were talking about before this episode that we have never talked about on the show before, and I'm so glad we're going to do it today. If you somehow land a board seat and perhaps got into it, maybe your best friend at the country club or something recommended you and you got sped through the process somehow, and you show up without knowing what to expect, which would be a bad situation. Now you're there on day one going, what the heck do I do? What does it mean to be a board member? Maybe I'll just be like the guy next to me. And I know you feel very passionate about that topic, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I do feel passionate about that. There's a little section in my book, The Governance Revolution, that talks about the state dinner, in that oftentimes the board member shows up at the board and is trying to figure out how to behave because, of course, one feels extremely honored about having been invited and a little bit worried about whether one will have the ability to contribute, and really kind of wondering what the rights and rituals are inside the boardroom and how to behave. So, of course, just as at the state dinner, you watch the guy sitting next to you pick up the utensil and you follow and you use the same utensil he uses because you can't figure out why there's so many forks and spoons on the table. So there is inevitably a little bit of mimicry in the early stages, but that can be looked at simply as moving gently into the situation. You don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to make people nervous and so on. So it is important to be gentle when you first arrive. And that is an excellent, excellent opportunity to also do research, ask lots of questions, be sure that the company is giving you the appropriate onboarding information about the company itself as well as about its industry and its competitors. And be sure that you build both formal and informal bonds to your fellow directors.
And I imagine for some people, there's a learning curve, right? Which is why some people go down different paths. Some people would perhaps start on a local nonprofit because there's less risk involved. There's more ability to, I don't want to say fail, but to learn, because there's growing pains on that role. Whereas if you were to land on, say a national leading nonprofit, maybe you became the Red Cross or the YMCA of America or something like that, that's really high profile, and you need to know what you're doing. Also, the people around the table with you are probably professional directors, and they play in their spare time with some leading nonprofits. In the same way, if you start becoming a paid member, perhaps maybe a small company, and you're trying to work your way up as well, there's less appetite to learn on the job. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, they may be a little bit different from what you expect in the sense that the main conundrum of being a director and being an effective director, regardless of the size of the organization or of its mission, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit, is the ability to develop trust in the room and to navigate the making of decisions as part of a group. Because the way boards work, the individual director has zero power. Mm-hmm. And the only power that exists is in the group. So that translates into having to learn to develop influence in a group of peers. Often, many of them are strangers. And there is a serious art to doing that. And that is what is worth doing on the smaller nonprofit boards and so on. Nonprofit boards, particularly small ones, do tend to have a fair number of directors, and also they're wrestling with really serious mission-driven problems. So it's a really good laboratory to learn how to work in the group. And the more effective you are in that group, the more likely you are to have confidence when you move on to a bigger stage. And confidence is really important.
And I like where you're going with this, and I think this circles back to something you and I were talking about before the episode started today, that if you have an experience that is wide-ranging, say earlier in your career. So for me, I did 12 years as a strategy consultant where you're working in different industries, different types of executives, solving different problems. You can bring all of that to bear as you start to specialize and you become a board member. If you're appointed, for example, like we talked about yourself, if people think of, oh, I know Deborah, she's all about strategic alliances. She gets M&A. We want her expertise and skill set. Of course, you are bigger than it. You've had all of these amazing opportunities, and you can bring that to bear in a problem. In some ways, when you're thinking about how do you work with group dynamics, there are different types of people in the room. You've seen them, you've worked with them before. What are your thoughts on boards should be looking for people who are well-rounded and have been there and done that in so many different spaces versus someone who's, deep dyed in the wool, just an expert on one or two topics, and those are what they need?
Well, of course, every circumstance is different. And there will be times when deep expertise in a particular area is really valuable. And we can certainly look at that, for example, in technology or even in accounting, as was demonstrated by Sarbanes-Oxley. But generally, the role of the board is fairly clear in that its major job is to protect the future of the corporation, to make sure that the corporation, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit, has a sustainable future. And as part of that work, it needs to be sure that its management is effective, and if it's not effective, it needs to remove them. It needs to be sure that there is a strategy that creates value or addresses the mission, both tomorrow and in many, many tomorrows. So those are the things the board is most importantly charged with, plus, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, the execution or approval and execution of major mergers and acquisitions and divestitures. So, but those are all methods of implementing the strategy. So the question of the overall makeup of the board becomes really important. The skills matrix is valuable as one set of information, but too many companies look at it as the holy grail. And what you really need on the board is people who have wisdom and experience and who can make distinctions between one kind of risk and another, who actually can look the CEO in the eye and tell him when he's wrong, or even tell her when she's wrong.
And to some extent, experience is how you've done that, right? And traditionally, boards have wanted people that were previous or current CEOs or previous or current CFOs because they've had that experience. They maybe gone through some of the hard times, and they can sit there and say, like, I know what you've been through before. Here's what you need to know, or here are the type of people we should bring in to connect from my network, and that's how I got through it the last time. That is valuable, but also a different mindset can be valuable of perhaps I've seen it in a different industry, or I've approached it from a different methodology in the past. And I think that's what you're getting to, is that you need people that can connect those dots, because if you're having a group discussion, and sometimes you need people who are going to be able to open up the funnel into different ways to think about other people who've said, great, we've had that expertise. Here's how I think we bring it forward and take it down. How have you seen that playing out on some of the various different boards that you've sat on?
Well, for the most part, I have been very fortunate in that I have been brought in as generally a known quantity, so that there was a reason that I was brought into the board, and I didn't have to fight uphill to make my voice known and to make myself trusted. But the challenge for any director is to build that reservoir of trust that the fellow directors and the CEO will place in that director. And so I actually do have a lot of sympathy for the boards that are excoriated now as being male, pale, and stale.
Right.
Because, of course, when you're trying to run a complicated company, you want confidence in your board. And the easiest way to have that confidence is to find people that are just like you, because you know how they think, and they know how you think. And that's comfortable. It's not scary. It doesn't require a whole bunch of additional effort to try to figure out what on earth are these people talking about. But that's also extremely risky, right? We look at nature and see that the tremendous benefit of diversity in nature, and we need to look at the board the same way to see that we need diverse opinions, we need diverse backgrounds, we need diverse people, so that we are doing our job as the board and protecting the company from the kind of risk that can ensue when monoculture, when everybody is the same age, same background, the same gender, looking at it from the same point of view. That's very dangerous. So while I understand why it exists, I'm very excited to see that the range of people showing up in the boardroom today is all of a sudden really changing.
And diversity of thought is the way that I think about it, because that's what leads to innovation. You need different perspectives from any spectrum you can imagine, and you need that around the room. And I think that also comes back to what we were talking about earlier, having at least some people who are on your board who have been in lots of different spaces and come from many different backgrounds, in addition to those deep specialists, are what are going to allow you to have those really good, thoughtful conversations to come up with the right strategy, to be able to check management at the appropriate times, to encourage them at the appropriate times.
Well, I think also you mentioned at the outset that you wanted to talk a little bit about M&A. And, it's no secret that mergers and acquisitions are very difficult to pull off successfully. We can look at the big public companies that have tried it and realize that, a number of them haven't been able to be successful, and they've had to undo themselves. And that is another reflection of the need for a board that has multiple points of view and is actively looking not just about the technicals of the merger, but also at the intangibles, about how you create a single culture out of two very likely very different cultures, how you bring top to bottom integration into play so that you get the best of both prior companies and you get the result that you're looking for when you develop the idea for the transaction in the first place. In other words, the synergies can be very attractive on paper, but very, very hard to realize because you're dealing with people. So you need to have people throughout the company that understand how to deal with other people.
And when I was a management consultant, we would do a lot of post-merger integration, and there was a certain amount of benefits that were publicly touted as often a driver for why that deal would be done. Rarely were they ever achieved, certainly not fully achieved.
Exactly.
One of the tactics we would often tell a board when they would talk about this, would say, well, that's great that you plan to do all this stuff. How much can you do immediately? You need to bring that forward, because if you're saying we're going to get these benefits in 3 to 5 years, in 3 to 5 years, you'll probably be on the next strategy. You'll have stopped thinking about it. You got to get them early if you're going to get some of these. But there's probably a very different conversation that happens in the board and in the C-suite versus, just as you said, to the boots on the ground for actually getting something achieved.
Well, you're right, because, often at the board level, what you're asked to do is approve the transaction, the financing, the share issuance, whatever it is that needs to be done in order to create the combined entity technically and financially, and to create the revised capital structure and all that sort of thing. But it's all too easy and happens all too often that the board then thinks their job is done. And they're not sitting there saying, okay, what's the 100-day integration plan? What are the top 5 departments that need to get integrated first? Where are we going to see the benefits? To look beyond, maybe the top 5 people into the guts of the organization to be sure that the integration continues. It doesn't all happen just because you slam 2 companies together.
Well said.
It's funny, I was invited a few years back. I got this email from Kuala Lumpur, which at the time was very exotic to me, thinking, wow, an email from Kuala Lumpur, how cool is that? And they were inviting me to do a seminar on how to be successful in mergers and acquisitions due diligence. Okay, that's interesting. Where? Well, in Beijing and Taipei. Really? Well, are you talking about China? Are you talking about Taiwan, China? Are you talking about Asia and the West? What universe of transactions are you talking about? Oh, probably probably Asia. Why are you talking to me? What do you want me to come and talk about? And they said, well, because Western voices sell. People in China want to hear what Westerners are having to say.
Interesting.
Oh, okay then. So I went for 2 weeks. They said, what's your daily rate? And I thought, well, I'd do that for free. And I thought, no, I'm not going to say that. So I told them my daily rate, and they said, well, we can't pay that, but we can pay this. So off I went to China for a couple of weeks, and it was absolutely fascinating because what they wanted was what everybody wants. They want the checklists. And of course, when you're doing mergers and acquisitions, there are millions of checklists, as you know from your management consulting background.
Right.
You got your document checklist, you got your closing checklist, you got your financials, you got all these things you have to do. And you can get totally lost in all the details that need to occur. So what the board needs to be doing is being sure that it is focusing on the why. Why are we doing this transaction? What needs to happen for us to get the benefit of the transaction, and who is driving that process? And they have to be pretty relentless about looking at that, because it is so easy for everybody else to get lost in their checklists.
And Deborah, is this part of the situation that led you to write your book on the governance revolution, which is, I love the subtitle, What Every Board Member Needs to Know Now?
That was sort of courtesy of the editor, Alex Lejeune, who has a wonderful title. Not only was she the National Association of Corporate Directors Chief Knowledge Officer for many years, but now she has an even greater benefit. She's the Chief Knowledge Officer Emerita. What led me to write the book was the fact that both as a director and an executive and an advisor to troubled companies, to many companies, even ones that are not troubled, but particularly troubled ones, I had vivid experience of the fact that a great many directors really don't understand what their job is. And this is understandable because many attorneys don't know what the job of the director is, and that it's not taught in law school, it's not taught in business school, and there are vogues in corporate governance. It surprises the number of attorneys that I know now, and they argue with me when I say no, the director is not a fiduciary for the shareholders. The director is a fiduciary for the corporation. And through that responsibility, they are then responsible for delivering the residual return to the shareholders. But their job is to protect the corporation for the benefit of the shareholders, but to protect the corporation. And a great many people do not understand that. It's very dangerous to think that your job as a director is, and this is not the nonprofit, this is the for-profit side, to, quote, maximize shareholder value. Because it's almost impossible to figure out what that means.
Right.
You know, how do you know if you're maximizing or not? Because you don't have a standard against which to measure. You know, how do you know which shareholders in a public company, given that there's a fair amount of turnover and they don't have to hold the shares? And how do you know what value to look at? So when that tyranny of the responsibility to maximize shareholder value is repeated over and over again as the litmus test of whether the board is doing a good job or not, everybody ends up defaulting to looking at today's share price. And that's really dangerous. If you just look at today's share price, you're not looking at the value that can be created by longer-term thinking. And the director really is the person charged with doing that. The shareholder isn't. The shareholder is trying to make a return today so that his or her numbers stack up well compared to their indices and compared to their competitors so they can keep the money that they're managing. They're not looking at long-term corporate strategy, no matter what they say. And so the director has to be doing that in order to sustain the corporation. And in fact, it sounds kind of hokey, but I would say that given the scale of a number of our corporations, it's also the case that focusing on that long-term sustainability is the same thing as focusing on the sustainability of the globe. I mean, it's critically important today to get this right.
That's very well said. Well, Deborah,
thank you.
I imagine for a lot of our audience, it's been incredibly helpful to think of you with a specialization, you know, someone M&A or strategic alliance expertise, but also someone with the general knowledge you've picked up over time and all those that you bring to the boardroom. I'm sure many of them will want to be picking up a copy of your book or following what you're doing and sharing. What are the best ways for people either to contact you or to see what you have going on?
Oh, that's very good of you. I was just putting finishing touches on a revised website today. My firm is solongroup.com, and the book is The Governance Revolution, What Every Board Member Needs to Know Now. It is available at Amazon, and it's also available at, oh Lord, there's another place, what's the name of it? Pub Graphics, PUBGRAPHICS.com. Supposedly it's there at a much lower price. And I will have an audiobook version of this first book out in the next few weeks. And the second book, which is Stakeholders, speaking out on corporate governance will be out probably early 2020.
Well, that's very exciting. And I'm just delighted that we were able to have you on the show today, Deborah. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
It's such a privilege. Thank you so much, because I really do believe that our corporate governance system is a good one, and it needs to be inhabited and populated by directors who really understand the job and are committed seriously to doing it.
Absolutely, and we can always be raising our game. That's always something we should be striving for.
That's true. I mean, I never talk about getting governance right. You can't do that. You can only get it right-er.
There you go. I like it. Deborah, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Deborah Midanek. It was great to hear from someone who is an expert on strategic alliances and M&A, on what that's been like in her career, how she's positioned herself for boards, how she's gone forward in terms of the networking, but also broadening her expertise and her skill set. Someone who clearly is passionate about the subject, which is why she wrote the book about the governance revolution. So much information for all of us to think about best practices in the boardroom, and especially the idea that when you become a board director, you don't just look to the person to the left or the right of you and follow their lead. You need to figure out the right things to do and how to be the right director based on your own background and experiences. Now remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu where you can get links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we bring to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.